All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty big. I mean, recent economic history stuff. We're talking about former President Trump's tariffs and like what kind of impact they had on the stock market.
Yeah, this is a big one. A lot of times we talk about economics in like this really abstract way, but this is a super clear example of how stuff happening in Washington can really directly mess with, investments and businesses all over the place, globally.
Exactly, yeah. So we went through a YouTube podcast script called Trump's Tariff Impact on the Stock Market, and it really laid it all out. So the goal here for you listening is to get a better grasp on how those trade policies, those tariffs, really shaped what went down in the financial world. Kind of like a crash course, so you don't have to do all the digging yourself.
I think it's really interesting to see how much government policy can really influence what happens in the market.
Yeah, so to get into the impact, I think we should probably start by making sure we're all on the same page about what these tariffs actually were, right? So the podcast we looked at, it explained how during Trump's presidency, there were these tariffs, like a whole series of them, and they were mostly aimed at China.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember it wasn't just about China. Like some of our allies got hit with these tariffs too. Places like the EU, Canada, even Mexico.
Yeah, that's a really key point. This America First trade policy.
Yeah.
It wasn't just one thing. It was like this whole approach, right? Using tariffs as a way to negotiate,
Yeah.
to try and get what they wanted on like the economic front.
And it wasn't just about economics either. It also had a big impact on, well, the whole global political landscape.
Oh yeah, for sure. It really shook things up internationally.
So as far as the goals of the tariffs, what the podcast said was the main things were, well, protecting American industries. They also wanted to shrink the trade deficit and try to get those manufacturing jobs to come back to the U.S. And there were a couple of big examples they highlighted in the podcast. There were tariffs on steel and aluminum, and then a big one, a 25% tariff on like $250 billion worth of stuff coming from China. I mean, that wasn't just, a small thing.
Oh, no, not at all. These were massive industries. A ton of trade going back and forth. With the steel and aluminum tariffs, I mean, the idea was to bring back domestic production, boost those industries here. They also talked about national security, how that was a factor. And then when it came to the Chinese goods, well, that tariff, it made a ton of stuff more expensive for Americans. Like think consumer electronics, industrial components, everything.
Okay, so now we have a clearer picture of what these tariffs actually were, the nitty-gritty. So let's move on to like how the stock market reacted when all this started happening. What did they think, right? And the podcast, they said there was this immediate period of like volatility. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Lots of uncertainty as these announcements started coming out.
Right, and that makes total sense. Like when you think about it, investors, they like things to be predictable. That way, they can make better guesses about like future earnings,
Yeah.
the health of the economy overall. And with trade wars, well, everything gets unpredictable. It's in the name, right? First, you have the direct impact of the tariffs, but then other countries might retaliate, and everyone starts worrying about, what's going to happen to global trade.
Yeah. And they gave this example on the podcast that really shows how intense things got. Back in 2018, when the U.S. and China were going back and forth, throwing tariffs at each other, the S&P 500 had some huge drops. I mean, that tells you something. The market was super sensitive to this whole trade war thing.
Yeah, for sure. The market was basically trying to figure out how bad the fallout could be from this whole trade war. And I think it shows how quickly people's perception of risk can change, especially when you're talking about companies that do a lot of international business.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom right off the bat. Like the podcast pointed out that some domestic industries, they actually saw their stocks go up, like the steel and aluminum producers we talked about.
Right. And that's an important thing to remember. These big sweeping policies, they don't hit everyone the same. Overall, the market might be freaking out because of all the uncertainty. But certain sectors, well, if they see less competition from foreign imports, their stocks can jump up, at least for a bit.
Okay, so we've seen how people reacted initially. Now, what about the long-term consequences, the stuff that really matters? The YouTube podcast made it clear the long game was a whole different ballgame.
Oh, absolutely. As time went on, the impact of the tariffs, it got mixed in with a bunch of other stuff happening in the economy. And also individual companies, well, some were better at adapting than others. That's an important thing for you to consider.
Right. And the podcast said that companies that could like switch up their supply chains, maybe find new suppliers or even whole new markets, they did okay. Or if they could just like raise prices without losing customers, they were fine too. But for a lot of others, it was a rough ride.
Yeah, it really separated the adaptable companies from the rest.
Yeah.
And when you look at the bigger picture, all that uncertainty from the trade war, well, it probably scared off a lot of investors. Businesses might have been hesitant to invest or hire new people when they had no idea what was going to happen with trade and how much stuff was going to cost.
And the podcast actually argued that this probably slowed down global economic growth, even if there were other factors involved. And when the global economy slows down, well, that affects corporate earnings everywhere and, in turn, stock prices. It's all connected.
It is. The global economy is like this massive spider web, right? You tug on one strand and it can shake the whole thing. So even companies that mainly did business in the U.S., they could still feel the effects of a weaker global economy. Less demand, less investor confidence.
But there's another side to this whole thing. The podcast mentioned that the tariffs might have actually forced companies to take a hard look at their supply chains and make them stronger, more resilient in the long run.
That's a good point. Yeah. It might have been painful in the short term, but this push to, diversify, to not rely so much on just one place like China, that could be good for stability in the long run. Less risk of future problems.
So let's dive a little deeper into how specific sectors were impacted. The YouTube podcast had some great insights on this. First up, technology. They took a pretty big hit.
Yeah. Tech relies heavily on China for manufacturing. So those tariffs meant higher costs for a lot of tech companies. They even used Apple as an example. They had to adjust their prices because of it.
And then there's agriculture. They got slammed with retaliatory tariffs from China, which really hurt their exports. I remember the podcast specifically mentioned soybeans.
Yeah, agriculture was right in the crosshairs, and it really hit farmers hard. The government actually had to step in with financial aid to help them out.
Yeah.
It's a good example of how these trade disputes can have a real impact on people's lives.
Yeah. And what about manufacturing? It seems like it was kind of a mixed bag for them.
Right. Like the podcast said, some U.S. manufacturers did see a benefit because there was less competition from imports.
Which was one of the goals of the tariffs.
Exactly. But you got to remember, a lot of U.S. manufacturers, they used imported parts and materials themselves. So the tariffs made those more expensive too. So it was a mixed bag for manufacturing, some winners and some losers.
And lastly, the energy sector.
Yep.
The podcast mentioned that the steel tariffs really impacted them, especially oil and gas companies.
Yeah, the energy sector needs a lot of infrastructure, like pipelines and drilling equipment, and a lot of that stuff is made with steel. So when the price of steel goes up because of tariffs, it affects new projects and expansions in the oil and gas industry.
All right, so taking all this in, what are some key takeaways for you guys listening based on everything we've discussed? What did we learn from these tariffs and their impact? The podcast had some really good advice.
Yeah, one of the biggest things is to make sure your investments are diverse. These trade disputes, they show how fast things can change, how whole sectors or even countries can get hit hard by policy changes. If your portfolios are diversified, it helps cushion the blow.
Totally. And the podcast also emphasized how important it is to stay informed, keep up with big policy changes, global events, that kind of stuff. It's not enough to just look at company numbers. Those big global forces can have a huge impact on your investments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When you understand how major decisions can create ripple effects, it really helps you make smarter investment choices. It's all about seeing the bigger picture and anticipating how things might change.
And, the podcast made another good point about what happens to the market during times of uncertainty. When there's a trade war or something like that, it's normal for the market to get volatile. But history shows that the market often recovers over time. So, being patient and sticking with your long-term plan is usually the best move. Don't panic and sell everything when things get bumpy.
Right. The market goes up and down. That's just how it is. If you react to every little bump in the road, you're going to end up making bad decisions.
So as we wrap up here, let's think about the long-term impact of these tariffs. The YouTube podcast touched on this too. What did they leave behind?
Well, one of the biggest things is the tension between the U.S. and China. That's still there. Even with the new president, a lot of the core issues and even some of the tariffs are still around.
Yeah, and the podcast also mentioned that there are still worries about supply chains. The problems those tariffs expose, well, they haven't completely gone away.
Nope. A lot of companies are still working on diversifying their supply chains so they're not so vulnerable. And that costs money. It takes time. It's a big strategic challenge for companies that do business globally.
It's interesting. The podcast pointed out that even Biden decided to keep some of the tariffs in place. It suggests that maybe we're seeing a shift in the U.S. towards more protectionist trade policies, at least in some areas.
Yeah, it definitely suggests that the whole debate about trade and tariffs, about how they shape the economy, well, that's not going away anytime soon.
So the big takeaway from the podcast is this. Trade policy, it's going to keep being a major force in the stock market and the global economy going forward. This story isn't over.
Definitely not. It's like a constant tug of war between international trade, government policies, and the financial markets. If you want to understand what's happening in the economy, you got to understand this stuff.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into how those tariffs from former President Trump affected the stock market. We used that awesome discussion from Trump's tariff impact on the stock market as our guide. We talked about how those policies, they were supposed to protect American industries and shrink the trade deficit, but they also made the market go crazy, created both good and bad situations across different sectors, and it all really showed how important it is to have diverse investments and make informed decisions. Do your homework.
And as a final thought, something to chew on. How trade is constantly changing, how countries are interacting with each other. Well, even if these specific tariffs change or go away, the way we think about global economics, national interest, all that stuff, it's going to keep being shaped by these forces. It's something to keep in mind as you navigate this crazy world.
Thanks for tuning in to the deep dive, everyone. Catch you next time.
See you then.